Thank you. Next slide, please. Well, I want to welcome everyone to the January CAC meeting. I hope you all are doing well. Certainly good to be January. It's good to have turned the corner on 2020. Not that 2021 has been much easier to this point, but maybe tomorrow things begin to change a little bit, provide some stability that we all need. So we're going to do obviously this meeting again by Zoom as a matter of public safety and to help broader participation from across the state. Farah went through some of the issues that we will navigate from an IT perspective. And I think, Farah, if there's one thing that we didn't touch on is the roll call votes. When we work through the logistics of this process today, we'll be calling on you in alphabetical order to place your vote, saying aye or no. So let's start that with the roll call. Farah. Actually, will Valerie do the roll call?
Yes, I will. I'm going to just pull up my video. Here we go. Thank you, Commissioner Sagos. Good afternoon, council members and designees. And when I call your name, please acknowledge your participation in today's Climate Action Council meeting. I acknowledge the participation of Co-Chair Sagos, Co-Chair Harris.
Here.
Commissioner Ball.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Donna D. Carolus.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Commissioner Dominguez.
Here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Gavin Donahue.
Present. Thank you.
You're welcome. Dennis Elsenbeck.
Here.
Great. CEO Falcone.
Afternoon. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? President Gertler.
Present.
Rose Harvey.
Here.
Bob Howard.
I'm here. Thank you.
You're welcome. Peter Iwanowitz.
I'm here. Thank you.
CEO Quinones.
Present. Happy New Year, everyone.
And to you. Commissioner Reardon.
Present. Happy New Year back to you.
Ann Reynolds.
Present.
Chair Rhodes.
Present.
On behalf of Secretary Rosado, Keisha Santiago Martinez.
I'm here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Raya Salter.
Present. Thank you.
Welcome. Paul Shepson.
Good afternoon. I'm here.
Commissioner Wisnauskas.
Here. Thanks.
You're welcome. And on behalf of Commissioner Zucker, Henry Splitoff.
I am here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Given that, council co-chairs, I note the presence of a quorum for today's Climate Action Council meeting.
Excellent. Thank you, Valerie. So our agenda, as you see on the screen, will begin with consideration of minutes. Dorian and I will then share reflections as council co-chairs. And then in the bulk of the meeting today, we're going to cover primarily three important topics. First, we'll hear about the strategies that the Waste Advisory Panel is evaluating. Next, Carl Moss from NYSERDA will talk about the integrations analysis that will be conducted this spring. And then we'll take a look at the proposed template that all the panels will be used to report some of the recommendations that will be coming to us. And then before we close, we'll provide agency updates, primarily from the DEC side, on the rulemakings that we put out in late 2020. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge a few things. First of all, thank you to several of you from the council who've been helping our DC and NYSERDA teams over the past few weeks refine some of the procedures and processes. And a few things have come out of these discussions. First, regarding the public participation in meetings and panel meetings. So it's our policy that all meetings of the panels should be open to the public to observe as much as possible, and that we will continue to post meeting summaries online for all of those meetings. Second, several of you have been asking about the posting of a full draft scoping plan by the end of the year and what the process will look like over the coming months. We'll talk about that today. And then several ideas, smaller ideas, but very important ones, including the way in which we conduct ourselves these meetings. The circulating of key materials in advance of the meetings to give everyone a chance to review and contemplate the substance, as well as allowing more time for substantive discussion during the meetings themselves. Both of those will begin to be implemented in the next meeting and thereon after. So in particular, we're going to need to schedule time in April for really thorough consideration of all the recommendations that we're going to be seeing from the panels. With that, I'll move to the next slide. Let's proceed with the consideration of the minutes from the last meeting. All of you received the meeting minutes in advance, and I want to open up this for discussion. Any discussion on the last meeting materials? Some tracking hands on here. I don't see any hands. Okay. Well, we can move to approve the minutes. Can I ask for a motion to approve?
Yeah, I'll move to approve.
Second?
Second.
Okay. Any disapproval? If so, signify by raising your hand. Okay, seeing none, I will note that the minutes were approved unanimously. I will now pass it over to my good friend Doreen Harris to discuss her views on the last few months. Doreen.
Thank you, Basil. Next slide, please. And the next. So yes, it has been a busy 2021 already, even though it's the 19th of January, specifically related to the State of the State address issued by Governor Cuomo last week. And this year's State of the State included, in our view, a robust list of bold initiatives, some of which you see listed here that carry forward New York's long record of leadership on climate and clean energy. I will take a moment on the next slides to detail a few of these exciting proposals, specifically related to renewable and infrastructure development, but not to be overlooked. There were also very exciting announcements related to renewable and infrastructure development as well. And as we talk about renewable and other types of infrastructure development, I did want to briefly turn the presentation over to our CAC member, Chair John Rhodes, who is ready to provide an update on one important study that was issued hot off the presses today pursuant to the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. John Rhodes, can I ask you to share a few words as to its status?
Sure, thanks, Doreen. So you said we were going to focus on the last few months' achievements. So this is one of the last few hours. Just this afternoon, we put up on the website for public perusal the power grid study. This is the report that DPS was charged with issuing in the Accelerated Renewables Growth and Community Benefit Act that you just cited. It's up there. It's called the Full Initial New York Power Grid Study. The matter number is 20E0197. Initial means it's this installment, the 2021 installment, and full means it is complete, about 750 pages of work. It's got three principal component studies, one looking at transmission needs, et cetera, related to offshore wind, another related to land-based renewables transmission needs at the bulk level, looking out to 2040, and then another study looking at needs related to the sub-bulk levels. It also includes thankfully, a summary report, which is a more succinct version that captures the gist. We think it's very well done. We know it's informative and has many interesting findings, and it represents a major milestone, not just in complying with the statute, but in terms of creating basically the information foundation for us to craft the right kind of transmission future for the state. I'll just steal the report's thunder a little bit. It really endorses the proposals that the governor has been setting forth for the last few years, but specifically the direction that he laid out for us, the ambitious direction he laid out for us last Wednesday. So it's there. I'm sure it will get interest, and then I'm sure it will get comments. So thank you all in advance for your attention.
Thank you, John. And again, congratulations to you on this milestone and to everyone contributing to it. It is an important component of the achievement of our green energy economy, as Governor Cuomo referenced in this year's State of the State address. So please do, you'll need more than one cup of coffee to get through that one. But again, major milestone for us together. And in addition to today's milestone on this slide are noted, I view important announcements as part of State of the State, again, that many of you as members of the Climate Action Council contributed to. I will note specifically announcements related to our Build Ready program, which is focusing on sites for potential renewable development that are underutilized in their current form. Also related to community solar development, specifically with the New York Power Authority announcement for at least 40 community solar projects by 2025. The establishment of the Climate Justice Corps with NYSERDA to fund and provide training for 150 year-long paid fellowships over the next 3 years to residents of disadvantaged communities working in and for these communities to advance clean energy projects. And also relevant for this group, the NYSERDA and SUNY joint issuance of the first solicitation for advanced technology training partners associated with offshore wind, which will train the first group of workers beginning in the summer of 2021. And announcements related to solar efficiency at affordable housing in partnership between NYSERDA and HCR and the New York Green Bank to collaborate on an innovative new deployment and financing model for HCR's affordable housing portfolio. Also highlighted was the State of New York Mortgage Agency with a new retrofits program as well. So all told, major announcements last week. Next slide, please. To target specifically progress with respect to renewable energy and green energy, it is true, as the governor said, green energy is a pressing moral imperative and a prime economic opportunity for us as a state. So the green energy program that he announced looked in total at establishing a total of 12,400 megawatts of green energy, enough to power 6 million homes and directly create more than 50,000 jobs and $29 billion in private investment statewide. So we have focused our efforts together on creating the largest offshore wind program in the nation, as codified through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And indeed, last week, Governor Cuomo announced the latest offshore wind and large-scale renewable awards, together representing the largest combined renewable energy awards ever by a state in the U.S. So once all of these projects are operating, I'm pleased to report that more than half of New York's electricity will come from renewable resources, putting the state ahead of schedule toward reaching its 70 by 30 goals. Next slide, please. Specific to offshore wind, for those who like visuals, we have awarded 2 new offshore wind farms off the coast of New York City and Long Island, together yielding a combined 2,490 megawatts of renewable electricity. and coupling that announcement with an announcement to upgrade ports to serve this industry. All told, we have now 5 dedicated offshore wind port facilities across the state, details of which you see on this slide. And as discussed, we are making a sizable investment in workforce training with the establishment of the Offshore Wind Training Institute based at SUNY Stony Brook and Farmingdale State College. So major offshore wind investments, all told, and those that will bring jobs from the capital region all the way to the tip of Long Island and beyond. So we're very excited about these announcements. Next slide, please. And indeed, when we look at all of this together, our acceleration has been rapid, to say the least. We have contracted for the construction of 68 large-scale renewable energy projects, bringing economic activity to 34 distinct counties. And now, last week, Governor Cuomo announced 24 new large-scale renewable energy generation projects to add to that list. So our progress significantly has accelerated, and in partnership with the New York Power Authority's Smart Path project from Messina to Croghan, transmission in Western New York, transmission in Marcy to New Scotland, as well as Rensselaer County to Dutchess County. And to round it all out, last week, NYSERDA issued a solicitation targeting renewable energy generation delivered to New York City through a new Tier 4 RFP, which is in and of itself expected to bring upwards of 1,500 megawatts of new renewable capacity delivered into the downstate region. So we have announced many exciting progress announcements as well as milestones in the last week, but I want to turn it to my co-chair to discuss some exciting progress on decarbonizing our transit buses as well. Basil?
Excellent. Thank you, Doreen. Congrats to you and everyone at NYSERDA, as well as NYPA, Gil, and John at DPS. Just a stunning set of announcements last week. And yes, it's been building for some time, but to see it all really come together as it has is really, really encouraging. Don't forget to get your DEC permits along the way. I might know a guy, but really happy for you. Next slide, please. So just quickly, a couple of announcements. This is a rehash of what we put out in December. If you missed it, some of the Volkswagen settlement funds now going into electrifying mass transit buses as well as school buses, a $16 million award to counties, and then an additional 2.5 for school buses. This really continues the governor's momentum on electric vehicles, no pun intended, and helps us to address the issue of air pollution on urban streets, which has been a problem for many, many years. Next slide, please. In addition, we made some announcements on rulemakings at the end of 2020, just at the very end of December, the value of carbon guidance, as well as the greenhouse gas reductions. Those we will discuss later in the meeting today. Next slide, please. So before we get into the waste panel progress report, Gavin, if you can, I want to give you 5 minutes or so to discuss the utility group report out. Is that something you can do right now?
Sure thing. First of all, thank you to Doreen and John, who've helped put this together with Donna, DeCarolis, and myself. By the way of big picture, we met as a group last week with the utilities, the T&D companies. We discussed opportunities to contribute. I think the demeanor and the tone in the meeting, and I'll ask Donna to jump in after I finish, was very positive. They view this as a great opportunity to participate. They want to be a resource for the CAC as we start moving forward and working group recommendations commit. I think what I would like to say, though, is that they would like to be involved with the working group recommendations before the working group recommendations are finalized. An effort to provide valuable input on decarbonization, electrification of buildings, how do you move carbon-free resources around the state. But if it gets to the council and the recommendations are already put together, it's really not a positive effort they see. And quite frankly, I agree with them. It's probably too late at that point to add their input. So I'd ask the state to consider that. And then the last issue that I think is really important is that we can't have a uniform solution to all these issues. There are regional differences. What works in cont'd service territory may not work in Buffalo, for example. So the regional differences of the utilities and what they do and the limitations they have certainly need to be considered. So I plan on regrouping with Donna shortly and regrouping with Doreen and potentially John to try to work forward for our next meeting, which will involve the state of New York in a more detailed way. Donna, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you covered it. It was a great meeting. There's great resources there, subject matter expertise, willing to pitch in as soon as possible to keep the process moving. And I think you covered it, Gavin, with the regional differences in blustery Buffalo as we have today. And I guess the other point too is that, you know, the utilities have a really important interface with consumers, and I think that's something that's going to be critical going forward. So with that, I think you covered it, and we'd love to keep advancing this. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Donna. So at this point, we'll turn it over to Martin Brand to discuss the waste panel and the progress they've made there. Martin, you've got 20 minutes, and I think you're going to leave 10 minutes for discussion. So over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year. Next slide, please. So since the waste panel was really created in November and fully appointed in December, we've made significant progress. I have to give great thanks to the panel members who have really set aside their time to get the panel caught up with the other panels. We've had a lot of good engagement so far. So far we've held 4 full panel meetings to date. We created a number of working groups that are sort of sub-panel in nature with a panel member leading the group to focus on strategies. They've had numerous meetings. It really brought a lot of energy to the process. We started some cross-panel engagement, particularly at the staff and the chair level, and we'll be looking to engage with panels moving forward as we've identified a number of cross-cutting issues. We'll be engaging with the Climate Justice Working Group next week, as many of the other panels have. And like many of the other panels, we have a public meeting that we're planning for mid-February at this point. But again, a great effort so far. We're about 2 months behind or so from all the rest, and I think we're catching up. Next slide, please. So we're going to run through these slides. You've seen this template before. This is one of those issues the Commissioner noted that at the next meeting you'll have a little more opportunity to look through some of this material ahead of time. But bear with me as I run through very quickly. At the last meeting, we had shared some of the goals that we had set aside for the waste panel to look at reduction of methane and greenhouse gas emissions through the various sectors in the waste infrastructure through New York State. These slides will sort of match those as we go forward. We've done some grouping and consolidating here, so not all the strategies are necessarily captured here, but let's give you a sense of what we're thinking about. When we set up a subgroup to look at really local waste diversion and local scale impacts on communities, as well as a group to really interact with all the other subgroups on climate justice and disadvantaged community issues. So these are some of the things they've been working on. They've been looking at community-based solutions to really help us with some of the other programs that you'll see in subsequent slides, but essentially capturing and diverting organic wastes before it gets to the disposal point at a local scale. So this could create jobs, promote recycling, compost outreach, education in disadvantaged communities, and really just pull some of the infrastructure down into the very local level. So we've had great input on this from some of our community partners that are both on the panel and we brought in to inform the group. So we'll be looking at a number of different ways that we can accomplish the goals of the larger waste panel, but really looking down at grassroots, local community issues, and mainly to obviously continue to look at reductions in methane emissions, but really to look at ways we can reduce the impact of the solid waste management infrastructure on disadvantaged communities where those burdens have really been focused for many, many years. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides are going to talk about one focus that we have, and that is to really look at the overall waste management infrastructure of the state and really take a hard look at transforming the way we handle and handle our waste around the state. So we're looking at things like waste reduction and recycling strategies. So things like extended producer responsibility and product stewardship to take out some of those difficult to handle products that are methane generators at landfills and transfer stations, and really to start targeting things like packaging, printed paper, carpets, appliances, those type of things that really contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, are difficult to recycle, and have limited markets. And this would put the onus back on the manufacturer really to really come up with a comprehensive product life cycle design, if you will, from manufacturer all the way to final disposal. Other things that might come in here would be expansion of the Returnable Container Act to take some more of those hard to market, hard to handle materials that the municipalities are struggling with at this point, and really increase the capture of those things. So we'll be looking at a number of different frameworks, legislative action, regulations, and then a number of other programs to really push out this transformative restructuring of the solid waste handling business in New York. Next. Same line, the whole idea of waste reduction and reuse, waste avoidance, if you will, capture products that still have useful life or products that have single-use life, again, talking about the packaging and those type of things where we can eliminate the creation of the waste in the first place. So we promote reuse, repair, fostering small community-oriented businesses, create jobs, incentive programs, and the like. So some of the ideas down there you see under issues to explore are things like single-use food serviceware and packaging, deconstruction projects for things like building materials, reusable packaging, and then really put forth the infrastructure for skills training for schools, vocational programs, and those type of things that will facilitate the materials exchange and repair investments that we would make across the state. Next. Again, you can't do it unless there's markets and capacity in New York State, so we're looking at a number of incentive programs to support markets and maximize the capture of all recyclables, obviously focusing on methane-producing waste. So again, the mixed paper, cardboard, those large volume items that are difficult to recycle and capture, like textiles and the film plastics and the agricultural plastics. Again, an idea here to continue to divert these materials away from disposal and capture or avoid the actual methane emissions in the first place. So we see there's a lot of benefits here. One is green jobs through increased local recycling. You know, as always, it's difficult to implement some of these things. We have to cite additional facilities, so there's local impacts there. And again, we have to find the appropriate mechanisms, whether it's financial incentives or regulatory changes to support that expanded recycling infrastructure within the state. Next slide. This one is really a big one. It's kind of cross-cutting across all the subgroups, so you'll see this mentioned in a couple of places as I go forward. But really, where we think the biggest bang for the buck in terms of methane reductions across the entire sector of waste handling is really organic waste. So you'll see things here like strategies like expand food donation, food waste reduction, and food scraps recycling strategies. As you all know, we passed a very comprehensive food scraps recycling law a year and a half ago. We're working on regulations now, but there's opportunity within that structure set up to really increase the collection of food wastes and divert those materials either away from the landfills, but also to close, the gaps in terms of feeding hungry people and increasing food donations. So we're looking at a number of strategies there. The entire organic diversion program that we're looking at could include things like agricultural products. We haven't spent a lot of time on that, looking at that sector and the feedstocks, but we're certainly taking a hard look at that as we go forward. We continue to look at ways to increase available capacity. There was, the food scraps law that's out there will drive some of that, but we certainly could make some changes again to close off those opportunities to increase diversion as we go forward. So there's a number of things we're taking a look at down under those additional thoughts. We for a number of years in the state, we've had money through the EPF and other funding sources to encourage this, but certainly more could be done. Next slide. These next couple of slides are sort of on the facility side. So, the obvious first place to look for methane emissions is from the waste management facilities themselves. So our landfill group and our waste management subgroups are really looking at fugitive emissions from landfills. So there's things that we can do to provide incentives to increase the gas capture from landfills and other solid waste management facilities. So whether it's financial incentives or additional regulations or permitting aspects, we're taking a hard look at all of those things. One of the big needs is to really establish performance standards for those facilities so we know what we're looking for, we can measure that, increase the data collection and the monitoring of those facilities, one to confirm the models that we're using for the emissions inventories, but also to make sure that we're meeting the goals and again, to continue to inform decision making as we work on collecting those gas emissions from these facilities. So there's a number of things we're going to take a look at, including the technologies that are out there and what can be done to upgrade those technologies, and including upgrading the infrastructure itself. Now, one thing we're also looking at, and it's not really reflected in a slide here, but the landfill group has been really looking hard at financial incentives in other parts of the sector, like the biogas, biofuels, waste to energy type aspects of landfills and solid waste management facilities. So they're working through various financial incentives, revenue strategies to facilitate the beneficial use of any of the methanes captured or any of the products that are captured moving forward, including some of the organics diversion. So we're not quite ready to put out some of those strategies yet, but the group is working closely in consultation with the Climate Office and others to really dive down into some of those strategies to increase the financial incentive and revenue strategies there. Next slide. So the next few slides are talking about our wastewater treatment plants and really talking about transforming the notion from our wastewater treatment is sort of being the end game, if you will, the end point, taking the waste out of the wastewater treatment type program and really looking at restructuring this to make it more of a water resource recovery type program. There's certainly a number of products, a number of pieces to the wastewater treatment plant scenarios that are out there now that lend themselves to, one, emissions reductions, but also creating product that has use beneficially around the state. So, one of the first things we're going to do, obviously, is look at fugitive emissions there too. So looking at how these systems work and what they're doing to handle leaks and methane emissions. We're looking at things like home septic systems, which indications are that those are a contributor to methane emissions around the state. We're looking at obviously application of anaerobic digesters and other type capture systems to create energy as we move forward. So there's a number of things that we're looking at to really capture those products. And the next slide will talk a little bit more about that. Next, thank you. So again, recovering energy, and this could be extended to essentially other products too, but we're looking at energy recovery, diversion of organics, and other high value and high strength wastes away from the landfills and extract that energy content or other beneficial use through actions taken at water resource recovery facilities. So we'll be taking a hard look at biosolids, at gas emission capture, those type of things, co-location of digesters to recover energy, reducing the volume of waste stream for disposal, and really there's a lot of opportunity here that we think to really transform this system of wastewater treatment around the state. A lot of ancillary benefits, whether it's reduced trucking miles, those type of things, as well as the local impact on the local communities. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here as well. Next. And again, here's just an example of diverting biosolids away from landfills. A number of facilities are doing that already around the state. One is they're difficult to handle. The other is that they are a contributor to local impacts like odors. So there's a number of facilities that are already diverting biosolids, but more can be done. So we can, by diverting biosolids, we can reduce methane emissions, we can sequester carbon, offset synthetic fertilizer use, and create usable products, as well as of continuing to move us, up that hierarchy of waste management. So avoid the methane emissions in the first place through composting or capture energy through anaerobic digestion or a number of other strategies. So that was very quick. I wanted to run through it quickly, hit all the topics, and then we can take a few questions if you have any. Next slide, I think, just to close us out. Okay.
Martin, it looks like we've got Bob Howarth. Bob.
Thank you, Basil, and thank you, Martin. That's you're covering a lot of territory there. I'm glad to see that. I have a question and then a concern or two. How quantitative are you being with all of these strategies when it comes down to how much methane emissions from the state are going to go down? And before you answer that, let me just say that to me, the devil is in the details on a lot of these. And let me give you the example. If we divert food waste, I think it's great to not put it in landfills. But if we put it into anaerobic digesters, this is something discussed in a subpanel of the Forestry and Ag panel. I gave a presentation on it, actually. It doesn't take a lot of methane leakage from those systems to do a hell of a lot of damage. And particularly at the farm scale, farmers are not well equipped to do that without some leakage. So municipalities where you have well-engineered systems and engineers running them can probably do a good job, but the details are really important. And just one example, it's a small detail of what you said, but I think we need to get into the details. You suggested that one use of methane that we generated from digesters might be as a transportation fuel, and I want to be on the record saying that's a horrible idea. Methane as a transportation fuel is extremely inefficient, and even when you use natural gas, the CO2 emissions end up being worse than from diesel fuel. And so, we really need to get these details correctly. But again, I want to know how quantitative you're being in the overall analysis, because these are most of them are good ideas. There's a couple of them I don't think are good ideas, but how much are we going to reduce methane if we follow through with the best policies?
So first of all, let me just make sure I can clarify. I don't believe I said that we were going to capture methane for transportation fuels. I think I was saying that in the wastewater resource recovery facilities, that one of the ancillary benefits of capturing the methane and either co-locating it through AD or the organics diversion of biosolids would reduce transportation impacts, I think is what I meant to say.
Thanks for that clarification, but your slide said that one of the considerations would be not to just use the methane for on-site generation, but rather for heating homes in the vicinity and perhaps the transportation fuel. That's what the slide said.
Yeah, I think we're leaving everything on the table at this point. Some of that is a function of trying to capture all our working thoughts into this slide format, certainly. But There's certain applications of transportation fuels have been done over the years, whether it's CNG or those type of things, at landfills. So at this point, we left everything on the table, but we understand some things are going to fall off. You make a very good point in terms about how we're going to calculate emissions reductions, how we're going to quantify that. And that's a concern. We have a number of models that we can look at for landfills. We can look at different models for, methane emissions from organic producing wastes. The difficulty is finding that baseline. So one of the suggestions we have is really to up our game in terms of monitoring, data collection, determining that baseline at these facilities around the state. And that's one. The other difficulty, frankly, is when you look at some of the waste reduction strategies that I put forth, is quantifying what we know, anecdotally or in your gut, if you will, that if you increase waste diversion from landfills, you increase recycling, you look at the entire life cycle analysis of waste avoidance, waste reduction, waste reuse, you're going to lead to greenhouse gas emissions. Difficulty is going to put a metric associated with all those different pieces and parts. So we are working through that. We're going to use the best information that we have, but very likely we're going to need some further research as we go forward into how those various sectors actually contribute to the waste methane emissions around the state. So we're working through those issues and would welcome any suggestions that you have and to help us quantify those things.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Peter and then Raya.
Actually, if it's okay, would you let Raya go first? She had her hand up before me.
Sure, I couldn't tell who came in first. Go ahead, Raya.
Following on the last conversation, and I appreciate that this baselining and this data collection piece is challenging. I would certainly support, support research into that baselining. I just wanted to make a comment that it should always be the context in looking at these emissions in regard to disadvantaged communities, et cetera, that the CLCPA mandates that emissions and co-pollutant reductions be prioritized in disadvantaged communities. So as I know you're going to be talking to the working group, and as you move forward, it's important to sort of remember that context, and we're trying to be as do as best, to be specific about our data and do the very best we can there.
No, I agree with you 100%, and the panel will attest the fact that I routinely preface almost all our conversations with those type of admonitions to them that always keep that lens of climate justice and disadvantaged communities in the forefront. We do have a sub-working group. The one that I mentioned is working on the local scale communities, but they're also providing sort of a larger oversight role, if you will, within the panel itself to take a look at all those EJ climate justice issues as we go forward. We will certainly prioritize our look at emissions reductions and, like you say, co-pollutant concerns in disadvantaged communities. The sad truth is that many of our solid waste management facilities reside in those communities already, so we cannot help but prioritize those type of emissions reductions there, but fully appreciate your comments.
Okay, Peter.
Yeah, I just want to uplift the comments that Raya just made. I want to associate myself with them directly because I think they're spot on. And I just add an additional point there. I mean, I don't know if it's up to us as a council to set direction to what these panels are deliberating, but Martin, I'd be curious, when the issue of incentives for combustion come up, is the council fully aware of what Raya just pointed out, what Bob Howarth had pointed out? I mean, there's a lot of issues here that I think the panel should maybe just walk away from, because I personally don't see how combustion of solid waste really plays in the confines of what is the CLCPA now. So,
to be honest, we haven't really tackled the waste energy combustion like the MSW, the municipal solid waste combustors. We haven't really dived down into that part of the sector yet. We're looking at we've spent more time looking at organics diversion and then possible opportunities for things like anaerobic digestion across the whole sector. But we've really yet to tackle the waste to energy piece. So
Okay, I just, maybe I misunderstood you there because I did see it on one of your slides and in the context of incentives there. I don't know if that was about waste energy or not, but I mean, I think garbage burning is just not going to be clean, and it's typically the plants that are there now are already in disadvantaged communities. So again, I just want to uplift the point that Raya made. And then just real quickly, I want to just say I'm really excited and happy to hear about the heavy emphasis on extended producer responsibility, because I think the more we do that, the less we'll be, you know, contemplating at the panel level these false choices of burning garbage.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.
Ann?
Yeah, hi, thank you. My question was actually for Bob. I was wondering if he would repeat his question so I could better understand that point. It sounded like you preferred not to have anaerobic digestion happening at farms and would rather have it happen at municipal facilities, but I wasn't really sure that I understood it.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I gave a presentation on this to a sub-panel of the Ag and Forestry panel last month. But the argument is, I was looking specifically at manure. And manure produces some methane as it is under normal processing. But if you put it into an anaerobic digester, you get a huge amount more methane. And that's great if we really capture all of that methane and use it for energy. But if, you know, a relatively small proportion of that is leaking out of the facilities, then it actually puts more methane into the atmosphere than if we'd just done what we've always in the past done with manure. And I don't know that the average farm is able to run their facilities in a way to keep those methane emissions sufficiently low.
Got it. Oh,
I think they probably are not.
so you're saying like land spreading, the traditional methods would be better.
Yeah, or perhaps a regional facility. I mean, if you have a well-engineered anaerobic digester where the methane is truly captured, I think that's a great idea for particularly food waste and things of that sort. But it has to be well-engineered, and we really need to pay attention to the leakage which can occur from these facilities. Doesn't take much to do a lot of damage.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob, for clarifying that. I don't see any other hands. So Martin and team, thank you for that. Next slide, please. I guess we're on the integrations analysis, and I'll turn it over to Carl Moss.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Basil. I'll just pivot over to Carl. We do appreciate everything that the Waste Panel is doing to produce expedited analysis and recommendations on the same schedule. So we are now transitioning to our next topic for the day, which is one that I think is quite timely as we head into the spring of 2021, specifically with respect to the integration analysis that we will be undertaking. And as we've seen, and as Martin has just underscored, we know the panels are all hard at work developing recommendations to submit to the council for our collective consideration. And in fact, we'll be hearing a little bit about that template in just a minute. However, these recommendations will specifically help us to inform the analysis you'll be hearing about now, an assessment that we have referred to as an integration analysis collectively. And the integration analysis will take the sector-specific recommendations from the advisory panel's proposals and provide us with a statewide assessment of collected reductions that advance to the CLCPA goals. So this assessment will help us to evaluate the recommendations and to begin to craft the scoping plan. So to tell us more about this analysis, the schedule that we are undertaking, and what it will entail, and what it will ultimately produce for our consideration, I have asked NYSERDA's Carl Moss, our Director of Energy and Environmental Analysis, to join us today. Carl, please take it away.
Thanks, Doreen. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you. Looking forward to when we can all be in the same room. As Doreen mentioned, there's a lot of hard work going on this month and in the next few months by each of the panels. But we recognize there's a need to integrate all of that hard work into a single story, which we can bring before you. So that's what I'm going to lay out for you in just a few slides. So we can do next slide. Just to start us off in the statutory basis, the integration analysis is grounded in the language of the CLCPA, which directs the council to estimate the emissions reductions associated with all of the recommended measures, and that will help us to achieve the CLCPA's goals, and to evaluate the costs and benefits of these recommendations. Next slide, please. So this slide presents a timeline that you've seen before, but it extends out now to 2022 and thus includes the public hearing process. So the integration analysis will provide a common framework through which to estimate emissions reductions and evaluate costs and benefits to support the draft scoping plan. Our pathways modeling framework will serve as the core tool set, but it will be supported by a number of complementary studies. And as shown in the timeline, once the advisory panels and working groups develop recommendations, there will be an integration into scenario planning, and the draft integrated scenarios will be provided to this council. Next slide, please. So the integration analysis will incorporate insights from the advisory panels working in all sectors. We'll also include those groups that are working across each of the sectors. We will be leveraging insights from two road mapping efforts in buildings and transportation, as well as the work on the power grid. And we just heard today our exciting news that the power grid study is now out, as well as some other smaller studies, including a look at fugitive gas emissions. Recommendations from the working groups will inform the integration analysis, as well as the scoping plan directly. There may also be recommendations that require long-term research, in which case this council may elect to recommend continuing research efforts. And finally, the integration analysis will inform various topics of interest, such as health co-benefits analysis and jobs analysis. Next slide, please. So in analyzing each of the recommendations, the integration analysis framework will capture interactions across sectors, including impacts to annual and peak electricity demand from buildings and transportation and electrification. We'll also look at electricity consumption associated with industrial processes. Other examples are a deep look into hydrofluorocarbon emissions that might be associated with energy uses. To illustrate what would be analyzed, we provide an example policy recommendation. So in this example on this slide, it's all new sales of passenger vehicles are zero emission by 2035. So this modeling framework would translate this recommendation into a projection of annual adoption of zero emission vehicles over time. It will track avoided fossil fuel consumption. It will look at the greenhouse gas emissions on net and the new electricity load. The analysis would capture how the grid would need to respond to meet those annual and hourly electricity needs while also reaching the zero emission goal. The scenarios that are developed through the integration analysis will include an assessment of resource costs, which include incremental equipment and infrastructure costs, as well as fuel costs, and the value of avoided greenhouse gas emissions. We'll also monetize the health co-benefits and will help to analyze what is the job creation potential. In this way, the integration analysis will present a comprehensive benefit and cost analysis as called for in the statute. So next slide, please. So in these subsequent slides, I'll provide a little more detail on the components that I just spoke to. So to start, the analysis will examine economy-wide incremental resource costs for the various scenarios relative to a reference scenario. For specific recommendations, the incremental costs could be less than zero, meaning that the reference case costs are larger than the scenario costs. So let me unpack that just a little bit. It's important to note that New York's economy will see considerable expenditure on fuels, equipment, and infrastructure in the coming years, regardless of the policies that are pursued. Therefore, the assessment of cost examines incremental expenditures compared to a reference case. Some other things that are worth noting, that the societal cost approach does not track internal transfers within the state, such as looking at specific levels of incentives. Also, outputs that we will bring forward to you in late spring will include annualized capital operation and maintenance costs for infrastructure, as well as annual fuel expenses by sector and by measure. This pathways framework does not produce detailed locational or customer class analysis. So any locational or customer class impact analysis would be developed through subsequent implementation processes. Next slide, please. So in addition to the resource cost, this pathways framework tracks annual greenhouse gas emissions by gas. To calculate the monetary benefit associated with avoided greenhouse gas emissions, we'll be using the value of avoided greenhouse gas emissions as described in the guidance that was recently published by DEC. And we'll be discussing that later in this agenda. Given that that's on the agenda, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I'm also happy to help answer questions around that when we get to it later today. So next slide, please. The integration analysis will also capture the value of health co-benefits, which are clearly an important and critical part of the CLCPA. We'll be looking at both the sector and the county level, and we'll be using EPA's co-benefits risk assessment health impact screening and mapping tool. This tool evaluates ambient air quality. It looks at SO2, VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, NOx, as well as direct PM, which are the fine particles in the air that come out of different forms of combustion. And then what the tool does, it looks at how all of those then lead to secondary changes in the annual PM concentrations, which have a significant impact on public health. So just to give you a flavor for what we'll be analyzing, the results include 12 different health outcomes. These include premature mortality, heart attacks, hospitalization, asthma exacerbation, and emergency room visits, as well as how that translates into lost work days. And there's a standard set of practice now of how we not only quantify those health outcomes, but then monetize them. And that will be part of our overall cost benefit analysis. Next slide, please. So in addition to evaluating these societal costs and benefits, integration analysis will serve as a key input to the Just Transition Working Group Jobs Study, which is called for in our statute. This linkage between the integration analysis and job study will show employment benefits of mitigation strategies. And as specified in the CLCPA, the job study will report on the number of jobs created to counter climate change, which shall include, but not be limited to, the energy sector, building sector, transportation, and working lands. Next slide, please. So just to quickly wrap up, and looking at our next steps, over the next month, we will share key sector-specific input assumptions with the advisory panels and the working groups and incorporate their feedback into the integration analysis. So we won't be waiting until the spring for when they have recommendations. We're going to be reaching out, as we have in the fall, and dig in deep with each of the panels in order to get feedback on those specific assumptions. And these assumptions will include details on performance and cost characterization, and on key technologies and mitigation measures. So with that, that's a quick run through of the overall integration analysis. Again, it's our framework of how to address the mandate under the CLCPA of looking at costs and benefits, and to take a deep look into the co-benefits, including health. So back to you, Doreen, and happen to hear any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. I did see some raised hands and do want to thank you for walking us through, what is a very complex topic, but in a stepwise function. So let's see how we did. I saw Ann Reynolds' hand go first. So Ann, go ahead with your question, please.
Sure, thanks, Doreen. Hi, Carl. I wanted to make sure I understood you. It would be generating societal costs rather than the cost to the state to do it, whatever the measure.
Right. So this is right, as we've done through previous energy plans and other processes. We look at the overall costs and benefits. So we look at what is the actual cost of the resource to build the new infrastructure. And then what are the avoided costs of not burning fuels? And that gives us our societal net cost, which then we can compare against the societal other benefits that aren't monetized, like greenhouse gases. But we won't be looking at the specific implementation measures. So one example would be for the last energy plan, where we put out our state goal of a 50% clean energy standard. There was then a follow-up, more than a year of detailed analysis that went through an exhaustive stakeholder process that actually put all of the very small specifics on the policy. And then that was then followed by a more detailed cost study that looked at what are the individual impacts of those very specific policy options. Does that help, man?
It did, thanks.
Yeah.
I will take my hand down.
Thank you, Anne. Next up was Raya.
Hi, this is exciting. Looking forward to this analysis. Thank you very much. Look forward to digging in, more to the information. It's really great. A couple of questions. One's a quick one. A bit in terms of the health analysis, county seems pretty broad. I'm wondering if there's a potential to do it at the zip code level. And my second question, I haven't read this exciting study that Chair Rhodes just announced today, but is the context of some of the grid modernization efforts that New York State is undergoing to try and capture peak shaving opportunities, to try and get large scale energy efficiency. I'm thinking of the Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding and subsequent actions. Are capturing those kind of grid modernization efficiencies, a part of this analysis as well?
Yes, absolutely. So, as part of there's a kind of rich detail in the power grid study, and we are looking to leverage that detail and those tools, which frankly go into much more detail, very specifically generator by generator of how they will or won't operate given different scenarios. And then we can translate those into change of greenhouse gases, as well as SOx and NOx and other pollutants. So we're looking and we're excited to leverage that power grid study work and feed it into this integration analysis. In terms of the geographic specificity, this is the most detailed tool set that we have and that we've found. Certainly open to hearing about other recommendations of how we can maybe translate some of those findings into an even more granular way. But this is the extent of the most granular tool set that we've been able to find to do this kind of very comprehensive analysis, again, looking at all sectors, all measures, and all the major pollutant types.
Thank you for that. Yeah, perhaps some supplemental analysis. I'm thinking, all of Westchester, all of, but I hear you about the complexity, and maybe there's some additional or supplemental efforts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Raya. That's a good action for us to take. Donna, you were next.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Carl. Nice to see you. I was curious, I think what you said was that it won't get down to the customer class impact level. And I'm not sure if you said regional. I was trying to take notes, but I'm just curious, when you mentioned subsequent analysis, how and when would that happen? And then how would all this help prioritize policies and pathways? Thank you.
Right. So yeah, no, great question. So we're going to be putting forward multiple scenarios that will be the synthesis of what all of our panels bring forward. And so in that way, this council will be able to look at trade-offs and be able to see, given different measures that might be implemented, what are the costs and what are the benefits that are going to be associated with those. So in that way, it'll help us all to think about, there won't be a kind of a clear winner, right? We've seen from decades of analysis that there's lots of trade-offs. And so we need to think about those and think about our ability to look at also risks of implementation, right? So we need to think about there's advanced technologies that might be assumed, and how much do we think those can be fully adopted at scale. So these are all the factors that will be helping you as a council to think through, but it will at its core look at the cost. So we will be able to see, what does the state as a whole have to pay for the new infrastructure and for the new fuels, and what will it save by avoiding fossil fuel combustion, and then layering on top of that greenhouse gas emissions and some of the health co-benefits. So we will have clear and monetized benefits and costs for the council to look at and to consider. In terms of kind of individual customer classes, again, that will come from subsequent analyses that when we really get very detailed into future policies, and as the regulations are rolled out, there are going to be regulatory processes like through the Clean Energy Standard where we'll be able to collectively unpack it further. But I want to remove any doubt. There will be detailed cost and benefit analysis, and this council will be able to see those trade-offs.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you for the clear answer as to the sort of the outputs as well as the ability to compare scenarios, Carl. I think that's an important aspect of this work that will be informative soon enough. Next up was Peter with his hand raised.
Thanks, Doreen. Carl, thanks for the presentation. It's great. I'm really happy to see this work going forward. As I mentioned in June, when the Pathways report was briefed for us by E3, I thought this was one of the missing pieces looking at the health impacts of co-pollutants in particular. So I'm really happy to see this. My question, I guess, and maybe it's not for you, Carl, but the co-chairs, to what extent are the panel members, all of them, being briefed on the fact that this integration analysis is going to go forward in the contents of what analysis is? Because I think that would probably inform some of the deliberations around the policy strategies that they're looking at right now, and some of those ones that probably are ill-advised. So rather than them continuing to deliberate on issues that would probably fail this integration analysis in terms of a benefit cost test, how much of this information is being, sent back down to the panel so they understand where this analysis is going?
Thanks, Peter. That's also a great question. We had made a particular effort to ensure that the advisory panel members were aware of today's agenda item, as it is a question that has been coming commonly before the advisory panels and the chairs themselves. So with this agenda in mind, we made sure they were aware that it was on the agenda for today. And I know that members of Carl's team, as well as Carl himself, remain a resource to those panels moving forward, because it is certainly true that that this is critical information for the formation of the recommendations. And also, as per Carl's statement, I think we are looking for specific inputs that may inform the studies as well. Carl, do you want to speak to that topic
Sure.
in particular? Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. So just to maybe recap, in the fall, I had my analytic team go to each of the panels and present some of the early findings from this kind of early pathways work. So that was the first intro for the panels to get a sense for the type of work that will be coming. Step 2 is to then, in the next month, go back to the panels and summarize both what are some of the key outputs, but more importantly, help vet some of the overall input assumptions. So what are the performance and key cost parameters? So that'll be a good way for the panelists to not only understand what's coming, but also have a direct impact on the work. And then after this integration analysis is done, obviously when we come back to the council, everyone will be able to see it. And, and we will iterate as needed, right? As it makes sense. As we start seeing new findings that maybe surprise us, we'll be bringing them to you and the council, and then we can go back and think about if we need to make adjustments.
Thanks, Peter, and thank you, Carl. So more to come in that respect. Looks like we also had a question from Bob. Bob?
Yes, thank you, Doreen, and thanks, Carl, for that presentation. I think this assessment you're doing is really the key thing behind the panel, our Climate Action Council business. So I'm glad to see it moving ahead. I had two questions or things for you to think about. One is that getting the greenhouse gas emissions inventory correct would seem to be critical to getting the costs and benefits correctly. So, and obviously the finalization of the current greenhouse gas emissions isn't scheduled under the CLCPA to be finalized until December of this year. So you're moving ahead without that. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are as to how you're going to handle the out-of-state CO2 emissions and methane, and to what extent it'll be like the 1990 baseline and to what extent it might be different. So that's question number one. Question number two, if I heard you correctly, we're going to use the social cost of carbon to do the cost-benefit analysis. And, I think the state's done a good job with the social cost of carbon, but as the report notes, the final costs are hugely sensitive to what one wants to use for a discount rate. And we on the council have never discussed what we think is an appropriate discount rate. In the end, if this is going to be from the Climate Action Council, we need to decide what we think an appropriate discount rate is, and then those are the values to use. So I'm wondering if we should perhaps be having that discussion with the full council sooner rather than later. But thank you for the great summary.
Sure. Yeah. No. Thanks for that input and for those questions. I think there'll be a discussion on the value of carbon subsequent. So I think this is just the kind of start of those conversations. And your first point is spot on. You know, the statute itself gives us a bit of a chicken and egg dilemma because we're finalizing our methodology at the end of the year, but we need to also have a scoping plan finished at that time. So recognizing that there's been a lot of hard work done by both DEC and ISERTA staff and working with a number of key stakeholders, which led to the limits rule. And we're certainly going to leverage those methods and those approaches in order to get some draft inventory methods that we can use for current emissions and for forecasting. So that's absolutely recognized that this integration analysis we do in the late spring has to be 100% consistent with the CLCPA. So what we showed last fall was not. It was using methodologies that predated our CLCPA framework. What we're going to bring back to you all in the late spring is going to be 100% consistent.
Thank you for that. I'm delighted to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob. Donna, I see your hand is raised. Did you have another question, or are you?
Sorry, a legacy hand. I will remove it. Thank you.
No worries. And with that, it looks like we have addressed the questions from the members. And so I do want to thank Carl for walking us through this, as we have all agreed, very important work we can all be anticipating in 2021. So Carl, I know more to come, but thank you for level setting us to our plan.
Sure, no problem.
Great. Next slide, please. And very timely, with this analysis in mind, we have asked NYSERDA's Kara Allen to walk us through what the advisory panels will be specifically submitting to the council at the end of March. Kara?
Thank you, Doreen, and thank you, members of the council. The slides I'm about to show consider the integration analysis you just discussed. It also builds from earlier direction of the council. So if I could have the next slide, please. You all will recall this slide from back in the August meeting. And as you can see here, the details were to include direction to identify the estimated scale of the impact, knowable costs to achieve the strategy, ease of deployment or commercial availability of a technology, potential co-benefits to the emissions reduction, advancement of climate justice outcomes, and impacts to businesses. So again, we've been building from the statute. We are building in mind with the integration analysis and the direction from all of you to the advisory panels back when we first brought them together. Next slide, please. The following template is intended to provide a framework for delivering the recommendations so that the council can consistently evaluate the work of the different panels. There are 3 types of recommendations that may be put forward by an advisory panel: a mitigation strategy, an enabling initiative, and adaptation and resilience. The difference between these 3 I will hit on in a moment here. So the mitigation strategies are actions that directly reduce emissions or contribute to the achievement of the greenhouse gas limits or increase carbon sequestration needed to achieve our net zero goal. Enabling strategies are actions without direct emissions benefit, but that enable or magnify the mitigation strategies, enhancing climate justice and just transition. Examples of an enabling strategy would be initiatives such as outreach, education, increasing awareness, capacity building, workforce development, and research and development. And enabling initiatives can be tied to a mitigation strategy or in support of a mitigation strategy. They may also be standalone initiatives on their own accord. And then finally, adaptation and resilience strategies, actions to help us adapt to the effects of climate change and increase our resilience to various climate hazards. It is possible that a panel may not have all of these types of recommendations, And while the slide I am showing you is labeled mitigation, the enabling and adaptation resilience strategies will follow this format. It is a generally prescribed format. It is possible that not all the fields shown on this and the following slides will be relevant to a recommendation. That said, I will go ahead and dive in with you into this general format. So each slide will begin with a summary of the initiative, as you can see here, an overview slide. The summary will contain a description of the recommended action. The type of action, is this something that would require legislative advancement? Would it require a regulatory advancement? So action type, the greenhouse gas reductions, or an estimated range of the anticipated reductions or sequestration, both in 2030 and in 2050, in recognition of the two goals that we have in the law. Cost and funding considerations, a sense as to the ease of implementation and relatedly possible barriers or risks to implementation, such as commercial availability, political, technical, economic roadblocks, and ways that the council may think about mitigating those issues. Next slide, please. The next slide is designed to break down the strategy and to help the council understand how the advisory panel sees the path forward for advancement. It will provide the components necessary to realize the strategy. So again, this may be other mitigation strategies. This may be enabling strategies. But the components that would be necessary to realize that strategy, who will lead the implementation of that particular component, stakeholders that would need to be engaged, and the amount of time required for the component to be stood up or made available. Next slide, please. Then we would end here with a benefits and impacts assessment, or anticipated benefits and impacts. So we would look here to provide an understanding of the benefits and the impacts to disadvantaged communities, including how the strategy will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, co-pollutants, and provide economic opportunities, as both Raya and Peter were speaking to earlier, the value of this and what the law says. So we'll be looking to collect that information, looking at health impacts and other co-benefits, and then looking to talk about just transition, some of the benefits and the impacts to our industries, to our businesses, and to our workers, including any of the communities that host these industries or businesses, as well as any risk of leakage and how we might mitigate the risk of leakage. And then the other section here is designed to capture anything that the previous fields did not provide an opportunity for the advisory panel to mention. So I'm going to pause here. I know that was a quick, brief overview, but again, this is the general template, aligns very much with what Carl said would be a benefit to the integration analysis, and aligns with the previous direction of the Climate Action Council. I'm happy to take any questions from members of the council.
Thank you, Kara. Just looking at the list, it does not appear that we have any questions. If you have questions, please do raise your hand. Okay, Kara, thank you. Thank you for the useful presentation and you know, simple template, but complex processes leading to it, correct?
Indeed, we'll be working closely with each of the advisory panels to make sure, again, that there is consistency in what you see coming forward from the advisory panel, so your review is made easier. So again, thank you all very much, and I believe we are now handing it back to Basil, Commissioner Segas, to walk us through our game plan for 2021. Commissioner, to you.
Kara, thanks. This slide here should be really just a review of the expectations for the coming months. You all know we need to get to the end of this calendar year and have the draft scoping plan in hand, and then we proceed to public comment at that point. So the way we're proposing to structure the coming months is as follows. The panels have 2.5 months to get their work to us. And after that time, leading into April 2021, we'll then meet. Now the next, well, not the next meeting, but I think the next big meeting that we will have as as a council will be the April CAC meeting. We may want to make that a more extensive meeting than the 2 to 3 hour meeting we've been doing. So maybe let's plan ahead for that. From April to June, that's when what Carl had been talking about, this integration study analysis, also launching into some of our topical deep dives, bringing in the review, the adaptation and resilience recommendations, as well as our consultation with the Climate Justice Working Group. Of course, the panels are supposed to be doing that as well. From July to October, the integration analysis results. Again, continuing some of those topical deep dives as needed. I assume we will need to do some of those as the recommendations come to us. We'll be working, our agency staff will be working on the draft scoping plan, putting that all together and providing drafts of it to you all for review. And again, continuing some of that consultation with the working group, the Climate Justice Working Group. And that'll goes to the end of December. So we have a little under 12 months to get this done. It's going to be a very heavy year for all of us, certainly all the staff and all of the council members. I'm confident we can do it. And then it's on the public for that comment period, which will be very important for us to take into account. So that is the concept of operations for the next 11.5-ish months. Any questions on the schedule? All right, well, listen, we'll leave that out there on our PDF as posted on the internet, on our website. Any questions you have on the schedule, please flag for our team. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll turn it over to both Maureen and Jared from DEC to talk about the 2 rulemakings that we had put together last month. I think Maureen is up first on the emissions limit.
Yep, thank you very much, Commissioner. Next slide, please. So as we've presented to the Council throughout 2020, DEC and NYSERDA were working on the development of the emission limit regulation, calculating the 1990 baseline and setting our emissions reductions requirements for 2030 and 2050. So we finalized that rule at the end of 2020. There was very little change from the proposal to the final rule, with some minor adjustments. You know, that we found small mathematical errors and refinements of receiving better information did not have a significant impact on the number. But we have that emission limit regulation now set, and as Carl mentioned earlier, we are working furiously to fill in the intervening years under the CLCPA requirements. So there is a lot that changed between 1990 and the most recent year that we have emissions data for. So there's a bit of a different process to get our inventory work up to date. We are required under the Act to conduct a public process with our inventory work. So we'll be working hard as a team to bring draft numbers on the most recent year, which I believe is 2018, for the panels to help guide their work, and engaging in stakeholder outreach effort to gain input and guidance on different methodologies for measurements of certain gases and new compounds that have entered the scene since 1990. We did receive good public comment. We were pleased with a lot of supportive comments, and our assessment of public comments addressed what we did receive from the public. We felt it was a really good process, and we're pleased to be at this point. Now Jared is going to speak about the value of carbon, and then we can take any questions after that. Jared?
Thank you, Maureen. Next slide, please. And good afternoon, everyone. So we've provided updates on the development and value of carbon guidance a couple times in this process. After obtaining public comment on a proposal was issued, I believe, in October. We finalized the guidance document at the end of December, as required by the statute. And so the value of carbon guidance, as required by the statute, looks at both a damages approach, which is commonly known as the social cost of carbon, and a marginal abatement cost approach. We're not establishing a marginal abatement cost at this point, recognizing that that's a tool that can be used in various sectors in their evaluation. Most appropriately, the power sector is probably best positioned to use a marginal abatement cost approach. So, in general, the focus of this guidance document is on, what's commonly referred to as the social cost of carbon. It's evaluating and identifying the global social, economic, environmental impacts of the release of a ton of carbon emissions. And so that's a tool then that agencies can use in valuing the benefits of the decisions they make. A decision that's going to result in a reduction in carbon emissions that has a value. And this enables the use of that value in those kind of evaluations. So, as Bob Howarth indicated in one of his questions, one of the key issues in establishing the value of carbon is establishing a discount rate. And what that refers to is, how do you value impacts in the future versus impacts now? If one was basically did not have a preference, valued the impacts in the future, say 200 years in the future, the same as impacts now, then one would apply a discount rate of 0. And the statute requires us to look at various discount rates, including 0. In general, that entities, experts that have done this in the past have looked at a range of discount rates ranging from like 2% to 5% or so. That's valuing current impacts more than future impacts. What we are recommending is using a value of 2%, a discount rate of 2%. That results in a social cost of carbon of $125 a ton of CO2 emitted. But we also suggest that agencies evaluate a range of 1% to 3%, so they can see, what that range of impacts would be under the various discount rates. And so that ranges from $53 to $421 a ton. The guidance also looks at how to value certain non-CO2 greenhouse gases. That includes nitrogen dioxide, which has a value of about $45,000 per ton, as you can see here, and methane, which is a value of around $2,800 a ton. Based on the evaluation of the U.S. Interagency Working Group approach. The guidance document provides guidance for agencies about how to use this value of carbon in various decisions. So, in making a procurement decision, for example, or evaluating the benefits from a permitting decision or a rulemaking decision, the guidance helps agencies understand how to do that. I guess one final thing I want to emphasize is, this is not a regulation. It is a tool for use by agencies. It doesn't set a price on carbon. It doesn't impose any fees. Instead, it is just a tool that agencies can use to evaluate and monetize the carbon benefits of the decisions they make. And again, going to a question of Bob's, and maybe anticipating the question he asked, earlier, is, this value of carbon is to be used by this council in its deliberations under the statute. I think the statute says that the council should consider the value of carbon in developing the plan. And so we hope it provides a useful tool for the council. So with that, I think we welcome any questions or comments, both from on the limits of rulemaking and this guidance document.
Okay, let's give the council a minute just to raise their hands. Don't see any up yet. Okay, Peter, you're first.
Thanks, Jared, for the walkthrough. I really appreciate the short course on the excellent work that the department did here. So thank you. I guess my question is maybe if you could help us just translate, seeing the recommendation of a 2% discount rate, how would that translate for the average New Yorker who might be listening into this Climate Action Council now to the actual sort of $20 that are, that is costing New York State, not the state, but New Yorkers right now? What's the social cost of carbon, if you will? And sort of like just raw dollars, how many billions?
Right. Well, I guess what I'd say is the value of carbon is based on the global impacts and not the impacts on New Yorkers alone. And so, I really can't answer that question based on the value of carbon. The idea is that, the emission of greenhouse gases have impacts all over the globe that the emission of a ton of carbon in China has the same impact on us as the emission of a ton of carbon in New York State. And so, it's the global impact that it values rather than in New York.
So with that global impact, like what is our global impact then in terms of like the dollars cost, the social cost of our emissions? Do we just take a straight, multiplication of $125 per ton and multiply that by our inventory?
Yes. That would be the global impact of emissions from New York State. And so you add up all the emissions, the global emissions. I mean, the impact, based on the anticipated damage caused by climate change is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And so even just New York's relatively small contribution is a significant impact.
Thanks.
Sure thing.
Thanks, Peter. Bob.
Thank you, Basil, and thanks, Jared, for that very clear explanation. Just one slight addition to what you said to Peter there, and then my question. I agree totally with what you say for carbon dioxide emissions, but for the social cost of methane, a sizable percentage of that is in fact local public health costs due to adding to ground level ozone. So more of it is New York based, I believe. My question, though, it goes back to what I asked earlier. You're recommending, the state's recommending this 2% discount rate. I'm not an economist, and I'll confess I'm not good at thinking about discount rates, but whether we choose 1%, 2%, 3%, I believe the CLCPA in its language even suggests that a 0% rate should be considered. I'm wondering what the justification is for the 2%, and I'm also throwing it out to my fellow members of the Climate Action Council. Do we want to have further discussion as to whether or not that is what we think should be used? Thank you.
Okay, and so Bob, just a couple comments there, and maybe Maureen can weigh in as well. I don't believe that methane value includes the ozone impacts, and I just want to be clear. Certainly for the CO2 value, it doesn't include impacts of from other pollutants, and I believe that's the case for methane as well. Is Maureen, is that correct?
I believe that is the case too. That what the damages models are considering.
Right.
I just well, we should have a discussion offline perhaps, but my understanding of the IWG report is that for methane they were including the health and other environmental consequences of methane based on Drew Schindell's work. And if not, I would argue that we should be doing it for the state, because the CLCPA talks about effects beyond just the climate effects. So that's important to get correct.
Right. Well, we should make that clear, absolutely, because it's, if it doesn't include the ozone impacts, the impact of a ton of emissions of carbon is more than $2,700 or $2,800 a ton. So on the how we settled on the 2%, we proposed central values of 2 or 2.5% for public comment. The Obama administration had used 3%, but a number of economists have indicated their views that 3% is somewhat too high, and recommended looking at and establishing a value of carbon based on lower values. I think so we've seen information from that summarizes the views of various economists, and it generally fell in that 2 to 2.5% range. And we moved towards the 2% range based on a view that that impacts that occur significantly in the future that impact our children, grandchildren, and the like, are still important, and we did not want to discount those too much. So that's why, informed by the economists and that value judgment, we decided that 2% is an appropriate value. But again, we encourage agencies to consider that range of values.
Well, and again, I mean, I appreciate you saying it is a value judgment, because it is. And if the Climate Action Council is to use this assessment as our core underpinning, then it seems to me we on the council should use our joint value judgment on it. And it may well be that we'd end up in the end agreeing with you that 2% is the best way to go. But I would suggest to my colleagues that that is something that we should discuss and agree on.
And I will just add to the health. There are health impacts that are modeled, but I believe, Bob, it's not all the health impacts. And the guidance does lay out the ability to layer in additional health-related damages in coming up with, a total value.
Okay, thank you for that. I would suggest that we, add those in again as we move forward to be consistent with the CLCPA.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Bob, I'd say, just going to, emissions in general, this is just valuing the carbon, the value of the carbon reductions. And, various strategies say you reduce transportation emissions. You're also reducing emissions of pollutants that cause, particulate matter and ozone, and those certainly have benefits. And that's where, the health benefit analysis that Carl talked about comes in. So you have the carbon reduction benefit, which is the social cost of carbon, and then you have those other health benefits that just add to it and demonstrate that activities have significant benefits.
Okay, Paul.
I just wanted to ask a question about what is an elephant in the room for me, which is New York City, in part because a lot of the health impacts and co-benefits occur in and downwind of New York City. I'm trying to remember about the cost of carbon in Local Law 97. But as I recall, it's some number like $258 per ton. That's really assessed relative to your limit, that is per ton above the limit. I'm just curious as to whether we will need to reconcile with the New York City local laws the way carbon is valued so that there is consistency. How is that going to go, since that local law has already engaged in putting a value on carbon reduction?
So Paul, I'm not familiar with what value Local Law 97 places on the value of carbon. This is a tool for state agencies to use in making their decisions. Certainly New York City agencies in making this, in reaching their decisions may choose a different value. And, I want to be clear that things, strategies that might cost more than $125 a ton may still have significant value based on all those other public health benefits that you and Bob have identified. And I don't know if that is part of the local line 97 consideration, but those are obviously part of our consideration as well. It's just not part of the value of carbon.
Okay, thank you. Raya?
Thank you so much for this presentation. I wanted to note, I know in the guidance, there was a lot of discussion about how, some greenhouse gases are sort of better researched and more well understood than others. And I know that when it comes to those co-benefits and the health study, I think that it would be fantastic if we could have a really robust look at what, how co-pollutants fit into that picture. If we're going to be looking at how to sort of taking deeper looks on how to better value the greenhouse gas emissions, that we may as well be looking at how do we look at some of those co-pollutants as well, just so that we can have the best health analysis that we can. So that's sort of, it's a little bit, as somebody who's read the guidance, that's a little bit deep, but I hope that resonated.
Yep, no, absolutely, and that would be part of the integration analysis. I mean, Carl or Maureen, do either of you want to speak to that?
We absolutely agree with your point, Raya, that that is why we left that spot in the guidance for the ability to layer in additional health benefits, because the modeling that has been done and the good science that we want to reference in the available guidance, we know is incomplete in some ways. So we wanted to make sure there was space there for those considerations.
Yeah, Jared, and I'll just add that this is Carl. We won't have a gap in the scoping plan analysis because we're going to be doing a full health benefits analysis. So we're going to be looking comprehensively using this value of carbon for the avoided greenhouse gases and then monetizing health co-benefits. So we will have a complete story here.
But definitely looking forward to seeing how we take a look at those co-pollutants in addition to those other greenhouse gases that are less well understood.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Assuming there are none. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so before I wrap things up, I just want to open it up generally for any other closing comments or questions. Gavin. You're on mute, Gavin.
Sorry.
Yep. We hear you now.
All right, thanks. Sorry about that.
No problem.
It's more of a logistics issue. Is there a chance that we could send to the council members presentations starting with Carl, Kara, and Jared? I mean, there's an awful lot of information here in the last 45 minutes. And it would be good to have it because by the time it gets posted, it's a little outdated sometimes. And a lot of briefing memos I need to do and others need to do. It would be great if we could have a copy of these presentations.
Okay, good question. What is the earliest, team? What's the earliest we can get materials around everybody here?
Hey, Gavin.
A link.
Yeah, so Gavin, this is Kara. We can certainly get it around to all of you. Actually, our web team does try to post the slide deck right after these meetings conclude, assuming that we have folks ready to go. So we do endeavor to make sure meeting materials are up no less than 3 days following the meeting. But the presentation, usually after we conclude our meetings, we try to get that over to the NYSERDA web team so that sometimes it can actually be posted right after the meeting, but other times you might see it the following morning. So meeting minutes would also be another example of something we try to turn around pretty quickly. But again, we can also make sure to get it to all of you. I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that our website is posting these materials and we do try to turn them around relatively quickly.
Thank you.
Rose.
Hi. I just really clear. It was a great description of where we're going from here, and it's nice to know that in advance. And you've thought about, you know, all of the different ways to analyze, and so I just appreciate all the thought, all the work that you've done, and your clarity here and the opportunity to participate.
Great, thank you, Rose. Bob, you have your hand up still? Is that you have a new question?
Yeah, just a brief statement. I also want to congratulate you for coming up with good steps forward in the organization. And I want to particularly thank you, Basil, for the statement you made at the beginning, recognizing that all of our panel meetings should be open and to the public. I've certainly heard that concern from some people, so I was very pleased to hear you articulate that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Paul, is that a latent hand?
It's a legacy hand.
Legacy, latent. All right. Great. All right, Doreen, any closing comments?
No, only to say, of course, my thanks, but also to Gavin's question, I will certainly send the slide deck later this evening to all of you. And we'll certainly have it on the website, to Kara's point, very, very soon thereafter. So that's it from me. It's been a great 2021. That's lots to look forward to. So just my thanks.
Great, thanks, Doreen. So our next meeting is the 17th of February. As I mentioned earlier, we're gonna have a meeting, probably a much more important, longer meeting in April. We'll get that on the books, and we'll get all of the 2021 meetings to the extent we can on the books and get those to you, so you have a reliable calendar. But thank you again for your participation today. It was a good meeting, and lots of good discussions, lots of good follow-ups. Hope you all are safe and have a great week. Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go Bills for any of the Bills fans that are still on. Thanks.